The clock on the stove read 5:17 a.m. when I saw it. I was on the back porch where I been every morning for 35 years, holding a mug of black coffee that was more about the warmth in my hands than the caffeine. The first light of dawn has a particular quality out here, a soft silver gray that doesn't so much illuminate the world as it does reveal it, layer by layer. First the silhouette of the old oak, then the long dark line of the fence, and finally the gentle roll of the lower pasture. But this morning, the light caught something new. It was a sharp, unnatural gleam. A series of small glass-like objects set into a long, black scar that hadn't been there yesterday. Then, a low thrum started, a sound completely alien to the usual chorus of waking birds and the distant lowing of my small herd. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the unmistakable buzz of a single-engine prop plane lining up for a landing. It was landing on a freshly paved and painted airstrip that was, by every map, deed and survey, filed with the county since 1923, located squarely in the middle of my pasture. I didn't move. I just stood there, coffee mug growing cool in my hands, and watched the little Cessna touch down, bounce once, and roll to a stop not 500 yards from my porch. The engine sputtered and died, and the sudden silence was more shocking than the noise had been. A few minutes later, a golf cart came zipping down the new asphalt, a garish, electric green thing that looked as out of place as the airplane. At the wheel was Brenda Miller, the president of the Eagles Landing Estates Homeowners Association, the sprawling beige-colored kingdom that had metastasized on the far side of my property line over the last decade. She was dressed in a pristine white tennis skirt and a pink polo shirt, her blonde hair pulled back in a visor. She looked ready for a 9 a.m. doubles match, not a pre-dawn property dispute. She pulled the cart to a stop, just shy of my overgrown petunias, and stood up, placing her hands on her hips in a posture of practiced authority. But she did not bother with a greeting. "A gable," she said, her voice sharp and carrying easily in the still morning air. "You need to get your animals under control. Immediately. This is an active runway. Now." I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was cold. I looked past her at my dozen or so Hereford cows, who were ambling towards the new, strange object in their field with a placid curiosity. One of them, a young heifer I called Daisy, was tentatively sniffing at one of the freshly painted white lines. "This is a community asset," Brenda continued, gesturing with a sweep of her arm at the 60-foot-wide, 3,000-foot-long strip of blacktop. "We have members flying in this morning for the golf tournament. You have 1 hour to get them off our property, or I am calling animal control and the sheriff. And the fines. Let me tell you, the fines will be substantial." "Wallying your property so fast your head will spin?" I remained silent. I looked at the runway, then at my cows, then back at her. I noted the precise time on my watch. 5:28 a.m. I noted the tail number of the aircraft. I noted her exact words, "our property." It was a declaration, a statement of fact in her mind, as solid and real as the asphalt she had paid to have poured over my grass. I kept my face perfectly neutral, took another sip of coffee, and met her gaze. She stared back, expecting, I suppose, an argument. An outburst, a surrender. She got none of them. After a few seconds of tense silence, she gave a little huff of exasperation, spun around and got back in her golf cart, speeding away towards the clubhouse. She had no idea. She had no idea of the scale of her mistake. It wasn't just that she'd trespassed. It wasn't just that she'd built an unpermitted structure on land that wasn't hers. She had no idea that the very ground she had just paved, the ground she had claimed with such unshakable confidence, was not just my pasture. She had no idea she'd just landed an airplane on a designated and federally monitored Superfund site. But before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain a few things. You see, This wasn't really about a pasture, or an airstrip, or even a dozen curious cows. It was about paper. It was about process. And it was about a woman who believed that rules were things you imposed on other people, while her own desires were immutable laws of nature. My name is Arthur Gable. I'm 72 years old, and for 45 of those years I worked as a civil engineer. Not the glamorous kind that builds soaring bridges or designs gleaming skyscrapers. I was the other kind. My specialty was land remediation and environmental compliance. I was the man companies called after they had poisoned the earth, and the EPA came knocking. I spent my life in a world of core samples, groundwater, monitoring wells, containment liner specifications, and regulatory statutes so dense they could numb the minds of lesser men. My job was to read the fine print. My job was to understand the long, tangled history of a piece of land, to follow the paper trail of ownership, contamination, and liability back through the decades. I didn't deal in opinions or feelings. I dealt in recorded deeds, certified lab results, and legally binding consent decrees. I was, in essence, a professional archivist of industrial sins. My wife, Eleanor, passed away 6 years ago. She was the one who loved this land for its beauty. She loved the wildflowers in the spring, and the way the fog settled in the low pasture on autumn mornings. I loved it for its simplicity, for its quiet. After a career spent cleaning up other people's messes, I wanted nothing more than to be left alone with my own. Eleanor and I bought this 100-acre parcel 35 years ago, when it was miles from anything. The house was a wreck, the fences were down, but it was ours. It was a buffer against the world. Then, about 15 years ago, a developer bought the 1,000 acres to the east of me. He carved it up into half-acre lots, slapped up a few dozen oversized houses with 3-car garages, and called it Eagle's Landing Estates. A few years after that, the housing market crashed, the developer went bankrupt, and the half-finished development languished. The residents who were already there formed a homeowners association to try and maintain some semblance of order. For years, it was a quiet, mostly invisible neighbor. That changed 5 years ago, when Brenda Miller and her husband, a retired hedge fund manager, bought the biggest house in the development. Brenda, it seemed, was constitutionally incapable of not being in charge of something. Within 6 months she had staged a coup, ousted the previous board, and installed herself as president of the HOA. And she ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in a Lululemon glove. Brenda's reign was one of performative tyranny. She instituted a Byzantine code of new regulations. Mailboxes had to be a specific model, purchased through a vendor she approved, at a significant markup. Lawn fertilizer had to be of a certain type, applied by a certain service. Holiday decorations were subject to a review committee. She would patrol the neighborhood in her golf cart, a clipboard in her lap, documenting infractions. She fined a family $200 because their basketball hoop was, in her opinion, a shade of orange. Inconsistent with the community's aesthetic. She tried to force a retired schoolteacher to dig up a rose garden her late husband had planted because some of the bushes were touching the sidewalk. Her power was absolute, because most residents were either too afraid of her, too busy, or too worn down to fight back against the constant barrage of violation notices and threatening letters from the HOA's lawyer. The origins of the Airstrip dispute began subtly, as these things often do. It started with the grass along our shared property line. The long, flat stretch of my lower pasture ran parallel to the backyards of a dozen or so Eagle's Landing homes. It was the only part of my property that was truly visible to them. One day, I received a formal-looking letter from the HOA, signed by Brenda. It was a notice of violation, claiming the grass on my side of the fence was over the 6-inch height limit stipulated in the Eagle's Landing covenants. It demanded I mow it immediately or face a daily fine of $50. I didn't argue. I didn't call. I simply went to my desk, pulled out the county agricultural zoning ordinances, and found the section pertaining to land designated for livestock grazing. I highlighted the part that explicitly exempted such properties from municipal and private aesthetic codes related to vegetation height. I made a photocopy. Then I wrote a very short, very polite letter citing the specific ordinance by number. I enclosed the photocopy and a copy of my most recent property tax bill, which listed the land's official agricultural designation. I sent it all via certified mail, with return receipt requested. This was a habit from my professional life. You never assume a document was received. You get a signature. You keep the receipts. A week later, the little green card came back in the mail with Brenda Malera's signature on it. I never heard another word about the grass. But I kept copies of everything. Her initial letter, my response, the certified mail slip, the signed receipt. I put them in a new manila folder. On the tab, I wrote in neat block letters, Miller B. That was the beginning of what I came to call the Brenda file. Over the next few years, it grew. There was a complaint about unpleasant odors from my cattle, which I answered with a certified letter containing a printout of the state's Right to Farm Act. There was a demand that I trim the branches of the old oak tree that overhung the fence line, which I answered with a certified letter citing established case law on property rights and airspace, along with a quote from a licensed arborist confirming the tree was healthy. Each time the same pattern, a baseless demand based on her feelings, followed by my quiet, documented, factual rebuttal. And each time, I added a new set of papers to the file. On paper I was building a case. She had no idea. The Airstrip idea surfaced about a year before the asphalt appeared. Brenda, in her quest to make Eagles Landing the most exclusive community in the state, decided it should be a fly-in community. It was a vanity project, a way to attract what she called a better class of resident. At an HOA meeting, she unveiled a preliminary drawing. It showed a runway. It was laid out perfectly over the flat, open expanse of my lower pasture. One of the older residents, a man named Henderson, who had been on the original pre-Brenda board, apparently raised his hand and asked, "Brenda, that's not our land. That belongs to Mr. Gable." Her response, as Henderson later told me, was a dismissive wave of her hand. "It's a historical easement," she had declared, with no evidence whatsoever. "It was on the original developer's plans. We just need to reactivate it. Our lawyers will handle the details." When I heard about this, I knew I had to act, but I also knew I had to act carefully. I couldn't just rely on hearsay. I had to create a clear, undeniable record that she had been warned. So I escalated my methods. I drafted another formal letter, this one addressed to Brenda and every individual member of the HOA board. In it, I stated clearly and unequivocally that there was no easement, historical or otherwise, on my property. I informed them that any attempt to survey, grade, or construct on my land would be considered criminal trespass and would be met with immediate legal action. To this letter, I attached 3 documents. The first was a certified copy of my property deed, free of any mention of easements. The second was a new survey plat. I had hired a professional firm to resurvey my entire property line just for this purpose, and the resulting map, stamped by a licensed surveyor and filed with the county clerk, showed my ownership clearly. The third document was more subtle. It was a single page, a copy of the cover sheet from a 1988 Environmental Protection Agency report. It was titled, Remedial Investigation, Feasibility Study, Northridge Chemical Corporation Site. I highlighted the parcel number, which matched the one on my deed. It was a shot across the bow, a professional courtesy. I was telling her in the language of my world You have no idea what you're dealing with. I sent this package to each board member's home address via certified mail. Return receipt requested. It cost me nearly $100. A few weeks later, all the little green cards had come back, each with a signature. I stapled them to my copies of the letters and placed them in the Brenda file. I had done my due diligence. I had warned them. On paper, my position was unassailable. Her only response was a 2-sentence email sent to my old, rarely used address. It read, in its entirety, Mr. Gable, I have received your letter. Our legal counsel has reviewed the matter and assures the board that the association is well within its rights to proceed with the community improvement project. I printed the email, including the header information showing the date, time, and sender. I added it to the file. She was calling my bluff. She didn't believe I had a bluff to call. For months, nothing happened. I heard the occasional rumble of heavy machinery from the Eagle's Landing property, but it was distant, and I assumed they were working on some other project. I walked the fence line every week. The survey stakes I had paid to have installed were undisturbed. I allowed myself to think that perhaps my letter, despite her dismissive email, had done its job. That perhaps their lawyer, upon conducting even the most cursory title search, had told her she was insane. I was wrong. She hadn't hired a lawyer to find the facts. She had hired a lawyer to tell her what she wanted to hear. They hadn't been working on another project. They had been doing the grading and prep work on their side of the fence, out of my direct line of sight. They had waited for a long weekend when I was visiting my daughter out of state. And in 3 frantic days of work, they had torn down my fence, paved the runway, installed the lighting, and painted the lines. They did it all at once. A blitzkrieg of construction designed to present me with a fait accompli. A finished fact, on the ground that they believed would be too expensive and too difficult to undo. Which brings me back to that morning on the porch. After Brenda sped off in her golf cart, I finished my cold coffee and went back inside. I did not call my lawyer. I did not call the sheriff. I did not stomp out to the pasture and yell at the pilot, who was now climbing out of his Cessna. Anger is a useless emotion in these situations. It clouds judgment. What was needed now was not emotion, but process. The same methodical, unyielding process I had used for my entire career. I went to my home office, a room lined with bookshelves filled with engineering manuals and binders of old project files. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and pulled out the Brenda file. It was nearly 3 inches thick now. I sat down at my large oak desk and got to work. First, I contacted my old colleague Gene, who had been my lead paralegal for 20 years before he retired. He was sharper than any 5 lawyers I knew and understood the beautiful, brutal logic of a well-documented timeline better than anyone. I told him what had happened. I heard him let out a long, low whistle. "Artie," he said, "you always get the interesting ones." I asked him if he'd be willing to consult to be a second set of eyes. He agreed instantly. Next, I began the systematic assembly of a new file, which I labeled Airstrip Encroachment. I started a new timeline document on my computer. 5:17 a.m., observed Runway. 5:28 a.m., confronted by Brenda Miller. I transcribed her threats verbatim. I downloaded the photos I had taken with my phone from the porch, showing the plane on my land and Brenda in her golf cart. The metadata in the image filesa, the time, date, and GPS coordinata would verify their authenticity. I then went to the closet and retrieved the new trail cameras I had purchased months ago when the rumors first started. They were high-resolution, cellular-enabled models. I had never deployed them, hoping it wouldn't be necessary. Now I activated their data plans and spent the next hour walking the perimeter of the pasture, placing them in discrete locations, disguised in the foliage of trees and thick shrubs. From now on, every action taken on that runway would be recorded, time-stamped, and uploaded to a secure cloud server. I was creating a new, unbroken chain of evidence. Then, I turned to the old files. The boxes from the sale of the house 35 years ago. I was looking for one specific thing. It took me 2 hours, but I found it. Tucked into a dusty accordion file labeled Property History. It was the full 500-page EPA Remedial Investigation Report from 1988. I had only sent Brenda the cover sheet as a warning. Now, I needed the details. I spent the rest of the morning reading it. The land, before it was my quiet pasture, had belonged to a small, family-owned company called Northridge Chemical. They made industrial solvents. And like many small companies in that era, their method for disposing of waste was to dig a hole and dump it in. For 30 years they had poured thousands of gallons of chlorinated solvents, heavy metals and other toxic compounds into unlined pits at the back of their property. When the company went bankrupt in the mid-80s, the site was abandoned and the EPA declared it a Superfund site. The cleanup was extensive and took 3 years. They excavated tons of contaminated soil. But some of the chemicals had leached deep into the groundwater. The final solution, the one approved by the EPA and encoded in a legally binding consent decree, was a process called capping. They placed an impermeable clay and synthetic liner about 10 feet below the surface, covering the entire contaminated area. Then they covered that with 2 feet of clean topsoil and graded it. This cap was designed to prevent rainwater from percolating through the remaining contaminants and carrying them further into the aquifer. The land was deemed safe, but with a critical, permanent restriction placed on the deed itself. The restriction was explicit. The capped area was limited to agricultural use only. It specifically forbade any activity that could compromise the integrity of the containment liner. The forbidden activities list was very clear. It included excavation of any kind, the driving of piles or posts deeper than 3 feet, and the construction of permanent, impermeable surfaces, such as buildings or pavement. Brenda hadn't just built a runway on my land. She had built it directly on top of a multi-acre, federally mandated hazardous waste containment system. The process of grading the land and preparing the sub-base for the asphalt would have almost certainly involved scraping and compacting the very topsoil that was part of the cap. The weight of the paving equipment and the airplane itself could potentially damage the liner beneath. She hadn't just committed trespass, she had committed a serious federal environmental crime. The fines for knowingly violating a Superfund deed restriction weren't in the thousands of dollars. They were in the millions. And the liability for any damage to the cap was absolute. I scanned the relevant pages of the EPA report. I scanned the specific language of the deed restriction. I saved them as PDFs. I emailed them to Gene. His reply came back in less than 5 minutes. "Oh, she has no idea," he wrote. "She's like a person who robbed a bank to steal a ballpoint pen and accidentally picked up the bag with $1 million in it. The trespass is the least of her problems now." He was right. The local sheriff was one thing. The Environmental Protection Agency was another thing entirely. The next morning, I executed the next step in my plan. I woke at my usual time, had my coffee, and then I went out to the barn. I opened the gate to the lower pasture. And then I did what I did every morning. I let my cattle out to graze. They ambled out into the cool air, their breath misting, and, drawn by some bovine instinct for novelty, they made their way directly onto the new Airstrip. Within 10 minutes, a dozen Hereford cows were standing around on the runway, flicking their tails and chewing their cud, completely oblivious to the fact they were occupying a newly designated landing zone. Daisy was licking the salt off the wing of the Cessna. I sat on my porch and waited. It didn't take long. Brenda's house had a commanding view of the pasture. At 6:15 a.m. I saw her storm out onto her balcony, phone to her ear. 10 minutes after that, a sheriff's cruiser was pulling into my driveway. Brenda was waiting for him, standing in the middle of the runway shooing at my cows with a broom. She was in full performance mode. When the deputy, a young, serious-looking man named Miller, no relation, I hoped, stepped out of his car, she launched into a frantic, high-pitched tirade. "Thank God you're here, officer," she cried. "This man, this Gable, he is deliberately endangering lives. He drove his herd of diseased animals onto our private airstrip. A plane is due any minute. He is trying to cause a crash. You have to arrest him. You have to do something." The deputy listened patiently, his hand resting on his notepad. He glanced at the placid cows, then at me, standing quietly on my porch. He walked over to me. "Sir," he began, "I'm Deputy Miller. Can you tell me what's going on here?" I had prepared for this moment. I wasn't holding a coffee mug. I was holding a thin, professional-looking black folio. I had learned long ago that the way you present information is just as important as the information itself. An angry man with a fistful of crumpled papers is a crank. A calm man with a neat, organized folio is a source of credible information. "Good morning, Deputy," I said calmly. I waited for Brenda to stop her shouting, which took a moment. When she paused to take a breath, I continued. "My name is Arthur Gable. I own this property." I opened the folio. The first document on top was a laminated large-print copy of the most recent survey plat, the one I had commissioned last year. I pointed to the clear, unambiguous property line and the large parcel marked GABLE. I said, "As you can see from this official county survey, this entire pasture, including the recently paved area, is located within the boundaries of my property." The deputy took the folio and studied the map. His eyebrows went up slightly. He looked over at Brenda. "Ma'am," he said, his tone shifting from one of responding to a disturbance to one of conducting an investigation. "This plat appears to show this is his land," Brenda scoffed. "That's a fake. It's a fraudulent document. The HOA has a historical easement. Our lawyers have all the paperwork." I didn't respond to her outburst. I simply directed the deputy's attention to the next document in my folio. "Deputy," I said, "this is a certified copy of my deed, as recorded with the county registrar. You will note the complete absence of any easement granted to the Eagles Landing, HOA, or any other entity." He read it. Then I moved to the final document. "And this," I said, my voice level, "is a copy of the deed restriction placed on this specific parcel by the United States Environmental Protection Agency in 1989. Please note Section C, subsection 4, which prohibits any excavation or the construction of permanent impermeable surfaces. I would like to file a formal report against Miss Safker, Brenda Miller, and the Eagles Landing HOA for criminal trespass, felony destruction of property, and violation of federal environmental statutes." I made sure to use the precise legal terms. I wanted it all on the record. The deputy's entire demeanor changed. The word federal does that. It elevates a situation from a simple neighbor dispute into something else entirely. He looked from my documents to Brenda, who was now sputtering, her face turning a blotchy red. He looked at the cows, who were still peacefully loitering on the runway. He looked at the airplane. He handed the folio back to me. "Mr. Gable," he said, his voice now crisp and official. "I'm going to need you to come down to the station to give a full statement, ma'am," he said, turning to Brenda. "Is this your airplane?" He gestured to the Cessna. Brenda nodded, speechless, for the first time since I'd met her. "Then I suggest you advise your pilot not to take off, and I strongly suggest that no other planes attempt to land here. This is now a potential crime scene." He then walked over to my fence line, took out his own phone, and began taking pictures. His body camera, I noted, had been recording the entire exchange. On paper, or in this case on digital video. My account was calm, factual, and supported by evidence. Hers was a hysterical, evidence-free tirade. That evening, I got a phone call. It was from a man named George Henderson, one of the HOA board members I had sent the warning packet to. He was the disillusioned insider. He sounded nervous. "Mr. Gable," he said, his voice low. "I'm on the HOA board. I need to talk to you. What I'm about to tell you is in confidence." I listened. He told me that Brenda had never shown my certified letter or its attachments to the rest of the board. She had simply stood up at a meeting and announced that their lawyer had confirmed the historical easement and that the uncooperative neighbor had been handled. She had presented them with a survey map, one that showed the Runway area as a distinct parcel labeled HOA Common Area. She had completely fabricated it. She had bullied the other board members, most of whom were her social friends, into voting for the project, promising it would double their property values. Henderson had voted against it, but he was the lone dissenting voice. He felt terrible. He said he had a copy of the fraudulent map she had used, as well as the official minutes from that meeting. He wanted to do the right thing. "She's a bully, Mr. Gable," he said, "and she's going to ruin this community. I'll email you everything I have." An hour later, the documents were in my inbox. The fraudulent map was an amateurish forgery, a clear alteration of an older county plat. The meeting minutes documented Brenda's false assurances to the board. I forwarded them to Gene, my paralegal friend. His response was succinct: fraud in the inducement. "She's cooked." The coalition began to form. News of the sheriff's visit and the federal issue spread through Eagle's Landing like wildfire. Suddenly, people who had been cowed by Brenda for years started to find their courage. I received emails and phone calls. A woman who had been fined thousands of dollars over the color of her garden gnomes. A man who was facing foreclosure because of a lien Brenda had placed on his home over the non-native species of grass in his lawn. They had all been too afraid to fight her alone. But now they saw a crack in her armor. They saw that I wasn't yelling or screaming. I was using documents and process. I had shown them a different way to fight. Gene helped me draft a standard template they could use to file formal complaints with the State Attorney General's office regarding fraudulent HOA practices. The dam of fear was beginning to break. Brenda, however, was not the type to retreat. She was the type to double down. Faced with a sheriff's report, a brewing internal rebellion, and the specter of the EPA, she made her final desperate escalation. 2 days after the deputy's visit, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my door. It was a lawsuit. She and the HOA were suing me for $20 million. The suit was a masterpiece of legal fiction. And it accused me of tortious interference with business relations, defamation, and creating a public nuisance. It was a classic selapsutea strategic lawsuit against public cooptation, designed to intimidate and bankrupt a target into silence. It was baseless, frivolous, and would be dismissed by any competent judge. But that wasn't the point. The point was to scare me, to bleed me dry with legal fees. Simultaneously, she sent out an email blast to all Eagle's Landing residents calling an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda had a single item: to vote on a one-time special assessment of $10,000 per household to fund the vigorous legal defense of our community's assets against outside aggression. She was trying to get the entire community to pay for her personal, malicious lawsuit against me. It was a brazen, reckless move, and it was the last piece of evidence I needed. It was proof of her intent to misuse HOA funds. I printed the email and the lawsuit, I placed them neatly on top of the growing stack in the Airstrip encroachment file. The Brenda file was now complete. The HOA clubhouse was a large, soulless room with beige walls, beige carpet, and uncomfortable beige chairs. It was packed. The air was thick with a mixture of cheap air freshener and palpable tension. Brenda's supporters, a coterie of women in expensive athleisure wear and men in golf shirts, occupied the front rows. They looked smug and defiant. In the back, scattered and nervous, were the othersa, the gnome lady, the grass man, George Henderson, and a dozen more residents who had finally had enough. I sat in the very last row alone. In front of me on the floor was a simple, elegant leather briefcase. Not a bulging, overstuffed mess, but a slim, professional case. Inside it were 3 neatly labeled manila folders. Brenda stood at a podium at the front of the room. She was dressed in a sharp, navy blue pantsuit, looking every bit the embattled executive. She began her performance. Her voice trembled with manufactured emotion. She spoke of her vision for the community, a vision of prestige, prosperity, and rising values. She painted me as a villain, a bitter, reclusive old man who was hoarding land and standing in the way of progress. She claimed my actions were a personal attack on every single resident of Eagle's Landing. "He wants to destroy what we have built," she cried. A tear rolling down her cheek right on cue. "This lawsuit, this special assessment, it's not about me. It's about protecting our investment. It's about protecting our home." She ended with a rousing call to arms, urging them to vote yes and show the world that Eagle's Landing would not be intimidated. It was a masterful performance. Her supporters burst into applause. She was about to call the vote when I stood up. "Madam President," I said, my voice calm and even, carrying easily in the suddenly quiet room, "I believe I am entitled to address the membership before a vote concerning a lawsuit in which I am the named defendant." All eyes turned to me. Brenda's face tightened. She clearly had not expected this. Her lawyer, a smarmy-looking man in a shiny suit, whispered something in her ear. She had no choice but to let me speak. To deny me would look like she had something to hide. "You have 5 minutes, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. I walked slowly to the front of the room, set my briefcase on the table, next to the podium, and opened it. I did not look at the audience. I looked directly at Brenda. "My name is Arthur Gable," I began. "I am a retired civil engineer. For 45 years, my job was to investigate and resolve complex land use and environmental liability cases. I deal in facts, not visions." I took out the first folder, labeled Property. "The issue at hand is the ownership of the land upon which this HOA, under the direction of M.S. Miller, has built an airstrip. M.S. Miller has repeatedly claimed that this land belongs to the HOA via a historical easement. This is a factual claim. Let us examine the facts." I turned on the projector that was set up for Brenda's presentation. It was the fraudulent survey map she had shown the board. "This is the map M. Miller presented to her board to justify the project. Then I placed a transparent overlay on top of it. And this is the official certified plat map on file with the county clerk's office." The overlay showed the truth. The runway wasn't on an HOA common area. It was a clean, solid red line, drawn directly across my property. There were gasps from the audience. George Henderson stood up. "That's true," he said loudly. "She never showed us the real map. She lied to the board." Brenda's face was a mask of fury. I ignored her and continued, my voice never rising. "This is a copy of my deed. This is a copy of the title insurance policy, guaranteeing a clear title free of encumbrances. There is no easement. There never has been. The construction of the airstrip was therefore an act of criminal trespass." I paused, letting that sink in. Then I picked up the second folder, labeled Liability. Trespass, however, is the least of this community's problems. Miss Miller was warned. I placed the signed, green, certified mail receipts on the projector, one for each board member. On the 14th of August of last year, I sent a letter to every one of you warning you against this action. In that letter, I included the cover sheet of this document. I held up the thick-bound EPA report. This is the remedial investigation report for the North Ridge Chemical Superfund site. The land you paved is not just a pasture. It is a federally regulated hazardous waste containment cap. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. The smug looks on the faces in the front row had been replaced by expressions of confusion and alarm. A containment cap, I explained as if I were giving a lecture to a group of first-year engineering students, is a complex system of clay and synthetic liners designed to prevent toxic chemicals from leaching into the groundwater. The deed for this property contains a permanent, federally mandated restriction against any excavation or paving, as it could compromise the liner. By building this runway, your president has not just violated a local ordinance. She has violated federal law. The fines for this are not in the thousands, they are in the millions. The cost to remove the runway and recertify the site with the EPA will be astronomical. Now the faces were turning to horror. People were whispering, looking at Brenda. Her mask was gone. Her face was pale. Her confident posture had collapsed. She looked small behind the podium. But I wasn't finished. I picked up the third and final folder, labeled Fraud. This special assessment, I said, gesturing toward the agenda, is presented as a fund to defend community assets. This is false. It is a fund to pay for a malicious and frivolous SELAP suit filed against me for the sole purpose of intimidation. This is a copy of the lawsuit. It is baseless. When I prevail, and I assure you I will file a counterclaim against the HOA for malicious prosecution. Your own legal fees for defending that will be substantial. Furthermore, by voting for this assessment, you, the members, would be knowingly agreeing to misuse HOA funds to finance Ms. Miller's personal vendetta. That, under state law, is called fraud. I closed the folder and placed it back in my briefcase. I looked out at the sea of stunned faces. So, you are being asked to vote. You can vote to give $10,000 of your money to a woman who lied to her board, knowingly trespassed on private property, exposed your community to millions of dollars in federal fines and cleanup costs, and is now attempting to use your money to persecute a private citizen. Or, you can vote no. The choice is yours. I walked back to my seat in complete silence. The collapse was total. Brenda stood frozen for a moment. Then she seemed to shrink, her face crumbling, as the full public weight of her miscalculation crushed her. Her lawyer grabbed her arm and they hurried out of the room through a side door. The vote for the special assessment was never called. Instead, George Henderson stood up and made a motion for a vote of no confidence in Brenda Miller as president. It passed unanimously. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. The new HOA board, led by Henderson, immediately retained a new law firm. Their first act was to formally withdraw the lawsuit against me and issue a written apology. My complaint to the state bar against Brenda's original lawyer resulted in his suspension for filing a frivolous lawsuit and failing to perform basic due diligence. The EPA, alerted by the sheriff's department, came down hard, but because the new board cooperated fully, and because I provided them with all my documentation, the fines levied against the HOA were significantly reduced, though still painful. The real financial blow fell on Brenda and her husband personally. The board's investigation, using the documents I provided, proved she had acted in bad faith and deliberately misled them. The HOA's insurance refused to cover the damages. She and her husband were found personally liable for the full cost of the runway's removal and the site's remediation. The bill ran into the high six figures. They had to sell their house to pay for it. The last I heard, they had moved to another state. There were also state-level criminal charges for fraud, which resulted in a hefty fine and a long period of probation. The community began to heal. The new board rescinded every one of Brenda's absurd fines. The known lady got a check in the mail, refunding her money with interest. The man with the wrong grass was free to plant whatever he wanted. The atmosphere of fear evaporated. People started talking to each other again. I even offered my own consulting services, pro bono, to the board to help them navigate the EPA cleanup process. It was the neighborly thing to do. The runway was torn up, the contaminated soil underneath it was carefully removed and replaced, and the site was reseeded with native pasture grass. Months later, I was back on my porch. It was 5:17 a.m. The sun was rising, revealing the world layer by layer. The old oak, the fence line, and the lower pasture, now a seamless expanse of green, dotted with my peacefully grazing cattle. There was no asphalt, no runway lights, no sign that the scar had ever existed. In my hand, I held my morning coffee. On the small table next to me was a letter from the Environmental Protection Agency. It was a formal notice, confirming that the remediation was complete and the site was officially recertified. It was the final piece of paper in a long story of paper. I folded it neatly and put it away. I didn't need a file for it. The case was closed. I took a sip of my coffee. It was hot. The air was quiet, filled only with the sounds of the morning. I thought about ownership. Brenda believed ownership was about assertion, about will, about taking what you wanted and daring anyone to stop you. But she was wrong. True ownership, I realized, isn't about a piece of paper in a file, as much as I relied on them. ETA is about stewardship. ETA is a quiet contract between a person and a piece of land. I had kept my end of the bargain. I had been a quiet steward of its history, its secrets, its vulnerabilities, and in the end, the land, through the long, indelible memory of its own paper trail, had taken care of me. The quiet was restored, and it was perfect.